rotting. And that's okay. Let's just throw it away, clean up, and move on. But this silly fruit fly here has an ovipositor or egg layer that can actually puncture the fruit and actually lay eggs inside the fruit, okay, inside healthy fruit. And then those eggs turn into maggots, and the maggots grow inside the fruit, and you end up eating maggots. And you may not even know it. And they're especially damaging, and I will tell you, I lost my entire crop last year of red raspberries. Blackberries are just as bad. Cherries, even cherries can be affected by these. And so this is a real problem, and they're very vigorous. They're like flies. They reproduce very quickly. And this is one of those that I'm not sure how we're going to overcome without pesticides. But hopefully we'll find a way. And maybe they'll peak and go away. We don't know. But right now it's a problem. Called the spotted wing Drosophila, 2 spots on the male wings there, and the Drosophila is just another name for fruit fly. Spotted wing fruit fly basically is what this is. I'll just throw this up there, we don't need to worry about it. But it's come here, it's been here for a few years, and it's going to be a real challenge for fruit production. Another one, as if that one wasn't enough all by itself, this one we're going to see probably this year, and the numbers will probably peak, and you'll know when they peak, and then they'll decline. Anybody have any ladybugs that come in the house to keep warm in the wintertime? Yeah. Well, if you have a problem with ladybugs, you're going to love ladybugs after this one comes in, because this one it's going to make ladybugs look like your best friend. This is called I'll just throw the name up here, brown marmorated stink bug. Brown marmorated stink bugs are coming from the east, coming to Indiana. They're in Ohio. They're in Indiana now too, and I've seen them. But when they really get here in big numbers, they congregate like those ladybugs do, and they come inside for the winter to keep you company. All right, and they smell, well, ladybugs don't smell really wonderful, but these make ladybugs smell like perfume. And so these come in the house in big numbers, and they're going to be a problem. So get your vacuum cleaners ready. But they have a piercing, sucking mouth part. So really like a needle, like a hypodermic needle that pierces into the fruit. And at that point, that spot in the fruit dies. That spot dies, and the rest of the fruit continues to grow. So you get this kind of dimpling effect on apples and things like that. What's also kind of neat about this one, that's not really neat, they like sweet corn, they like tomatoes, they like green beans, they like all the things that we like. On sweet corn, what they'll do, and you'll see this probably next summer, they will come out and they will pierce through the husk, right through the husk, and they don't waste the time peeling the husk. They pierce right through the husk, they get into the kernel, extract the juices, and you don't even know it until it looks perfect, and you peel it back, and you've got brown kernels all over your cob. Now, have I turned you off fruit yet? All right, okay. All right, Roy Mabby, excuse my brain is full. That's about where you're at there. So, real quickly a little bit about apple trees, and we can't really go into everything, but talk a little bit about the birds and the bees here. Those are obviously apple blossoms. Pollen has to be moved. To make a fruit, you have to move pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. And that's not just as simple as taking 1 grain of pollen and moving it over to the pistil of the flower. It's a more complex than that. It has to be done at the right time, when the pollen is ready, and when the environmental conditions are right, when the pollinators are there to move the pollen and move more than 1 grain of pollen. In order to get a completely pollinated fruit, you have to have multiple grains of pollen, and multiple grains of pollen that are viable, and also from the species that can pollinate that apple. It can't come from a pear tree. Can't come from a peach tree. So it's just amazing this happens. Thankfully, we have bees to do a lot of this for us. All right. Now, I put this picture up there. We know, you've been around long enough to know that trees go through this progression of development in the spring. As temperatures increase and day length increases, they go through this slow progression of growth. So people who tend fruit trees and fruit in general don't look at the calendar necessarily. We're not calendar oriented. If you really care about fruit, you're looking at the stage of growth of the tree. Not in calendars. Trees don't read calendars. You have to read trees, not calendars. So the trees will go through specific stages. And whether it's a peach tree, an apple or pear, whatever, you have to know what these stages are. And they don't change. They're the same every year. That's good. But there's a dormant stage, a silver tip stage, a green tip stage. We're still at dormant stage, and we'll start changing pretty quickly as we move forward. Then half-inch green, tight cluster, pink. That's when the blooms are still tight buds, then bloom, and then petal fall, and then fruit set. So those are important because different pests will be present at different times. Your opportunity, because the pests follow the growth of the tree. Pests don't read calendars either. So you need to think about the stage of development of the tree and think about how you're going to treat those trees based on that stage. And this is very clearly, we have a wonderful publication called ID 146. It's only a couple years old. It's very good, and it uses these stages to tell you what to do to protect the fruit, protect the tree. And so you take those, you put them up on the garage wall, and you say, okay, what stage are we at this week? And then you know how to treat that tree. What kind of thing would you not be treating with at bloom? What kind of thing would you not be spraying with? No insecticide. Thank you. Yeah, no insecticide, because we don't want to kill our pollinators, and our pollinators are insects. So drop the insecticide out. The problem with that is most of our pest controls for home fruit tree production are called multi-purpose fruit sprays. And so multi-purpose means like the Swiss Army knife. It has multiple things in it. It'll have a fungicide, an insecticide, and a miticide. So if you start spraying a multi-purpose fruit spray, back in here sometime, and you're spraying along, what happens at bloom? Now you're spraying an insecticide at bloom. That's not good. So at that point, you have to stop spraying, and that leaves a window where the fungus can cause a problem. So as you get more and more, and that's about the best you can do, because you don't want to kill your pollinators. If you get into more fruit trees than just a few, just a couple, 3, 4, 5, then what you'll do is probably get into having a fungicide and an insecticide that are separate. And so you'll be mixing those through these stages here, and then when you get to bloom, you drop the insecticide out and keep spraying with that fungicide. Okay, and that keeps that protection, because remember that our fungicides are not really that great. Our fungicides are just protective paints, and so as you paint that plant with fungicide, you've protected the part you covered. But what happens is that plant keeps growing. So now it starts to expand, and now there's parts of the leaves that aren't covered with pesticide anymore. You have to spray again and repaint that plant and keep spraying. So as the fruit keeps growing, you keep spraying to protect more fruit. It grows more, you protect more. And so that's why you have to keep spraying this fruit. Nobody wants to do it, but that's how the protection works. Uneven pollination, so if you lose your bees, or it's too cold for the bees to get out and fly, or we've killed off all our native pollinators, that's not a good thing, but we're working pretty hard at doing it. You'll get apples that are lopsided, kind of misshapen, asymmetrical. And if you look inside, you'll see a fully developed seed and maybe a seed that's not developed. So that apple was pollinated enough not to abort, but yet it's misshapen. So it's more than just one visit of one bee to one flower. It's repeat visits. And not every flower is able to pollinate itself. Some have to have pollen from another variety of the same plant. And that's, again, more of the art blending with the science. We're not going to spend time on that, but you'll see charts like this in good catalogs that tell you about which variety of apple pollinates which variety of apple. Okay? And if you only have room for one apple tree, gosh, not going to get any pollination, right? No fruit. You might get a few. Plant a crabapple nearby. Crab apples can cross with our apple trees. They're very prolific, and so if you want a beautiful crabapple, then or give one to your neighbor to plant. It doesn't matter. The bees will cross the property line and transport that pollen from the crab apples over to the other trees. And really, really, really think about protecting these bees, and not only honeybees, but all of our native pollinators. You know, if you've got a fence row that's grown up, don't bush hog it, because that's where these natives live. If you have a wetland, don't drain it, because that's where these native bees live. We're going to have a beautiful sterile environment one of these days where no pollinators live. Only use pesticides where you need them. Use an integrated pest management approach. Use the least toxic pesticide possible. So what's a pesticide that you associate with being commonly used and very low toxicity? 7. Everybody uses 7. People used to use it on their dogs and cats and chickens. And it's all over the place. People are out there. I've literally seen people fill an old sock with 7 and go out there in the garden and shake it like this. And they're covered. And 7 is one of the most toxic pesticides there is in the world to bees. Bees and 7, or it's carbaryl insecticide, they will kill them. All right.
Is diatomaceous earth? Is it?
Diatomaceous earth is a it's ground up, more of a physical kind of a thing. It's an abrasive, yeah. So it's not going to be as big a deal. But 7 is extremely toxic, and also 7 on a fruit tree. You think, well, I'll just use 7 on my fruit trees. What's interesting about 7 is an insecticide. It does that, but it also acts as a fruit thinner. I've actually seen people spray their fruit tree with 7, and all the apples hit the ground. They all literally thin and fall off. So if you want to take the apples off a tree, spray it with 7. It acts not only as an insecticide, but also as a thinner. If you read the label, it says it right on there. And or if you spray Boston ivy with 7, it'll take every leaf off your Boston ivy. So read that label. Same thing with maples. So be careful with those. Just because we associate them with everybody uses it, that doesn't mean it's safe. Use sprays instead of dusts. Dusts are too much like pollen, and these bees are like flying dust mops, and they bring that dry material back to the colony and kill their sisters. Okay, so it's better for that bee to die in the field than it is to bring that back to the colony, because then they groom each other and spread that within the hive. Also, spray just the plants you need to spray, not everything in the neighborhood. Remember, if you're spraying that fruit tree and there's dandelions on the ground in the orchard floor, what are you also spraying? You're spraying the bees that are on the dandelions. Okay, so that's not good. All right, real quickly through some things about dwarf trees. Dwarf trees are the way to go. If you're buying a standard tree, you're just making a huge mistake in my personal point of view. If you're growing these for home production or commercial production, even the large commercial operations are going away from the old standard trees, and they're going to a very high density planting of super dwarf trees. Actually, in some cases, growing them on trellises like we would grapes, but at a very high density, where you can actually pick every apple from the ground. No ladders. I don't like ladders. I don't climb ladders, don't get on roofs. And so you can pick every apple. And what's kind of neat is, let's pick a variety, Gala. Let's use Gala as an example. Every one of those trees could be a Gala tree. Every one of them, regardless of the size. Because we're going to take Gala, the scion wood, or the wood from the apple we're going to eat, and we're going to graft it onto a rootstock that limits growth. So the rootstock limits growth. And depending on the size of tree we want, we can make a Gala tree that big, or we can make a Gala at maturity that's literally big enough that you can actually reach the top of from the ground, okay? The same variety of apple can be any size you want it to be, depending on the rootstock that you put it on. The rootstock is a lot like the engine of the automobile. And some of us probably wouldn't go buy a car without checking what was under the hood. The salesman's going to say, yeah, but it's got pretty wheels. It's got a pretty, black paint job on it. And you're going to say, well, what's under the hood? And he's going to say, have you looked at these rear view mirrors on this thing? And they're going to just, so it's so important to buy a car knowing what color it is and what kind of wheels it has, but also what kind of engine it has, because the engine makes the car go. The same thing is true with an apple tree. Yes, you want pretty fruit and you want tasty fruit and healthful fruit, but you've got to know what engine it has under it. So you have to know what root it's growing on, what rootstock, because that's going to determine, whether it's that monster or whether it's that little petite tree that can grow in your 5 or 6 or 10 in your backyard. Okay. Now, if you go to, and I'm going to name some names, if you go to Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, any of the big box stores, if they don't know the rootstock that tree is growing on, say, thank you, I'll buy my lumber here, but I'm not buying my fruit trees here, because you can't tell me the full story behind this tree. Now, the day when they can tell you what rootstock it's on, now we'll talk. But unless they can tell you the rootstock, you only know half the story. So what all these trees have been, this little chip was taken out of there. In this case, this bud was inserted into there. That would be your Gala. That would be your Gala apple tree, or your Macintosh. That one little piece with a bud on it, that gets inserted into that, and that rootstock is not Gala. It's some entirely different. That's the engine that you're grafting the body onto. And then that becomes the tree. That dominates the tree. Could you put 5 or 6 kind of apples on one rootstock? You sure can. You sure can. If you only have room in your yard for one tree, you can graft 5 or 6 or 10 different varieties on that one apple tree. Can you put a peach tree on an apple tree? Doesn't work that way. You can't graft a pear onto an apple or a pear onto a peach, but you can put 5 or 6 or 10 kinds of apple onto one apple tree. I'm getting way long here. But this big bulbous area here, that's the rootstock down below. This is the signed wood up here on top. The rootstock not only affects the size of the tree, it affects the disease and pest susceptibility. It affects the age of bearing. So if you have a gala apple on a big rootstock, you may be waiting 5 or 6 years to pick that first apple. If you put a gala apple on a bud 9 rootstock, which is a very super dwarf, you'll pick apples the next year. It's amazing. Now you can overdo that. If you put too much of a fruit load on a very juvenile tree, you will set that tree back dramatically. But and it also has an impact on the anchorage. So if you have a very exposed windy site, you want a tree that's very well anchored, or you better be putting a big stake next to it. And I don't mean a little bamboo cane. This is going to be a stake that's going to be with that tree for its entire life. And it's going to always be on the windward side. So if the wind comes out of the west, you're going to put that stake on the westward side, and you're going to fasten that tree to it forever, basically. So it's got to be something strong. These are all the same variety. These just happen to be Red Delicious. What a nasty apple. But this, look how big that tree is right there. What happened? I don't have any bias in my apple variety preference, but what's wrong with that? What happened to that tree? No, everything there was treated the same. Everything was. It's the same rootstock. So that makes it extra confusing, because you would think, oh my. It's on the same. What happened was, wherever you put those two varieties together, that's the graft union. And if you plant that graft union below the soil, or if you plant it up and then you mulch over it, the tree on top will root into the soil. And then you lose the benefit of the rootstock, and you have this very aggressive top growth taken over. And that's what happened here. They planted that a little too deeply and mulched up too high, roots took off, and then you lose your dwarfing. And again, supports are very, very important. I know Tuttle's Orchard, if you're familiar with Tuttle's, they put in 6,000 trees recently. Okay. And 5,000 or 6,000 trees last year, very high density, very close together, and they're getting geared up to grow some really good fruit for the future. But the days of going out to see that big old monarch of an apple tree, those are over. We're not doing there anymore. Those trees are very inefficient, and remember, sunlight makes fruit, so there's only a very thin layer on the outside of that tree that makes fruit, because it's too dark inside. So when you think about, you're wasting the volume, the productive volume of that tree. So if you can reduce the size of the tree and create more trees with more exterior exposure, now you have more fruit and better color on the fruit. Sometimes rootstocks don't knit together very well at the top, and wind will take them over, so you really have to stake them up. And you can have you can make your own tree, you can make your own fruit tree with the right roots. You can select your own rootstock, select your own top wood, put them together yourself. It's very easy to do. We can show you how to do that. Or you can actually go online and have your trees made for you, just like you'd have a custom Corvette. I followed a truckload of Corvettes up here today. I have a custom Corvette made, put this engine in, put this body on, this color, and design it yourself. You can go on to Adams County Nursery website, and you can choose what rootstock you want for your needs. You can choose your favorite kind of varieties. You can have them put together, custom made, and they'll deliver them to you, okay? And so don't just take what anybody tries to sell you. And I guess I'll kind of wrap up with this. Top work. If you make a mistake, if you realize, I bought all those Red Delicious trees and I just realized I hate Red Delicious apples. Nobody will eat those things. And you've grown them for 3 or 4 or 5 years. You've got these beautiful trees lined out there. The soil's been improved. What's your options? Dig them all up, cut them all down. That's terrible. You control what goes on in that apple tree. If art and science, you can go back and cut those limbs off and actually take new varieties. If you decide, hey, I do like galas or Honeycrisp, you can come back in and you can take a piece of that and make it grow to the existing tree. All right, you may want to put 1 or 2 there just in case one doesn't work. But remember, just underneath that bark is where the active vascular tissue is. It's just underneath the edge. The center is just wood. It's not active. So you have to take that little pencil-sized sprig of wood and line those tissues up with the outside of that vascular cambium, and then it will take off and grow and then dominate that tree. So the rootstock is here, and now what happens if you get water sprouts coming up off this? Cut them off, because they will take over. they'll take over. But you can actually, if you move into a new home and there's a nice looking apple tree there, but it's a variety you don't like, cut the limbs off and graft in some new limbs, and you can make half the tree Red Delicious and half the tree Gala. You know, whatever you want to do. So, but if you could make a peach grow on that tree, now we need to talk, because that's not going to be. Yeah.
That might be a really dumb question.
No, that's fine.
Okay, if you make it half one variety and half the other, you still have to have another tree to pollinate.
No. You can have half the tree pollinate the other half of the tree.
Okay.
Yeah, you sure can. Yeah.
We have some dwarf apple trees, and they've been doing really well, but what's the best way to fertilize? Do they need to be fertilizing every year?
You know, a soil test is good, but soil test should be done really at the outset before you plant them. Yeah, I know you can't, but more than likely in our soils that we have here, unless it's been stripped off and subdivided, and you know sometimes they take all your soil away, that's a different story. But it still almost always comes back to being a matter of percolation and infiltration and drainage, not a matter of fertility. These trees will grow in pretty poor soils. So yeah, I would go back and I would have the pH checked for sure. And I would have the phosphorus and potassium checked. Yeah, and definitely look at those. But generally, nitrogen is not the limiting factor. If you're fertilizing the lawn, these trees have way more nitrogen than what they need. So, yeah.
I've heard that pruning, you want to cut the branches that head down off.
Yeah, these branches that want to hang down, and they eventually will do that because they have a fruit load on them too. They're called droppers. Those are the ones that are going to take your hat off when you walk next to them. So yeah, as that branch comes down, you want to train it'll have branches that are trying to come up. And if you take the end of the limb off and you leave the last branch as one of those that's going up, that whole branch wants to go up now. So, and if you have all the branches that want to go up, like this Red Delicious tree, they all want to grow, like Bradford pears. Those branches all want to go straight up. When they're young, you can bring those limbs down. Again, you're tilling that tree, you're training that tree and directing the growth, but it's just like a teenager. Don't wait until they get into trouble before you start guiding them. You know, get them when they're young and move those branches down. And sometimes you'll even hear those branches crack a little bit. It's kind of like teenagers too. But you may have to tie them down or brace them down, and eventually they will take up your guidance and they will stay that way. Yeah.
What's the best way to train them? Unhung things from them, like weights?
Yeah. No, the braces, they make plastic braces, or you can also take little boards with a sharp nail in each end and just jam the nail in the trunk and pull the branch down and jam the nail in the other branch and force it down. But do that early in the spring, because that's when the sap is rising, the wood is more flexible. If you do that to a Red Delicious, you will hear cracking tissue inside there. So, but that's part of it. Yeah.
I've got a problem with a lot of suckers under my lawn sap.
Oh, all those little things that come up.
Yeah, that's not considered rootstock, is it?
Those are probably coming from a rootstock. Some rootstocks are more prone to suckers that come up. So that's one of the reasons I would be careful picking. I think Mark is one of those rootstocks that is very prolific. But you can prune those off, of course, and really best to let them, as they just first come out, get a very big, heavy leather glove and just kind of push them off. You know, don't let them grow. Don't let them get the size of a pencil. But when they're very young, just kind of rub them off with a glove. Or there is something you can spray called sucker stopper. It's a hormone that will actually cause those suckers to not form. And really, if you're going to cut them off midsummer, because they're less likely to grow back in the spring. Everything's grow, and they're going to grow. So in the summertime, they're redirecting their resources. They're less likely to resprout. I think we're about out of time, but yeah. Sure.
I've been told that I should thin my apple trees.
Uh-huh.
Okay? What's the best way to do that? I mean, we shake them, and I wonder, that doesn't.
Oh, to thin the fruit. To thin the fruit, sure.
Because they're so prolific, it has
Yep.
like better fruit,
Yep.
less fruit.
Well, the first thing is create a tree that is open enough to get sunlight in there, because otherwise the fruit won't be good anyway. And really, the rule is, this is kind of an old-fashioned rule, there's a couple ways to say this, but the tree ought to be thinned enough to where a robin can fly straight through the tree without hitting the limb. I mean, really open it up. You're not going to hurt it. You're really not going to hurt it. Some people used to say about you should be able to throw a cat through the tree without hitting it. And if it didn't work, try it again. I'm going with the robin, okay? So once you set the fruit, there's going to be so much fruit. It's so prolific. If you have a good bloom period and lots of bees, you'll get more fruit than the tree can handle. And so you'll go into a period, the good news is the tree realizes this and it will automatically abort a big percentage of the fruit in June. It's called the June drop. So if you look at your trees and all of a sudden in June all your apples are on the ground, or a lot of them are on the ground, not all of them, that tree is actually trying to thin and preserve itself and redirect resources. Still not going to thin it enough. So you need to go back in there and take the apples off about the distance between your tip of your thumb and the tip of your finger. That leaves enough leaves to produce sugars to fill out that apple. You got to have enough spacing between those apples to do that. Now, how do you do that?
There's a cluster of apples.
Yeah.
Like full leaf one.
Yeah, there's almost always a king blossom. That blossom on the outside edge of that cluster is the king blossom. That makes your best fruit. The problem, and that's the one you'd like to have stay there. The other fruit, but if you get a good bloom year and all pollination, all of them will set. So now how do we get them off there? Well, you can pick them up. If they're dwarf trees, you can do that by hand. That's not, these are big trees. And so the apple producers, the commercial apple producers use chemicals like Sevin, and Sevin could be used like this, but there's other ones as well. They're growth regulators, and they will spray. And this is where the art really comes into it, because if you spray at the wrong time, the wrong moisture content, temperature, you'll put them all on the ground or have no effect at all. So what that farmer wants to do is spray that tree, and at a time when the little blossoms behind the king blossom will drop off and leave that king without killing the king blossom. So and that's done with chemistry. With peaches, you really have to thin those, otherwise you won't get any quality. Peaches tend to be very pendulous. When they're a little fruit, they tend to be like little heavy footballs. And in Kentucky, they call this the Kentucky bumper system. They take an old axe handle and they wrap cloth or fabric or foam rubber on the end of it, and that's the Kentucky bumper. And when those little fruit get about the size of maybe your thumb, they're very heavy, very pendulous. They're hanging off that little tiny pedestal, and then they hit the branches with that Kentucky bumper. All right, and that makes those little fruit swing, and a lot of the immature ones will fall off. And so that's just a real crude old way to thin them.
But really the best way is just to make sure your branches are proper.
Absolutely, that's step.
Preventative more than.
Yeah, that's true, but that won't be the full solution, because that's gonna get you halfway. But that also makes it easier for you to get in there and thin them, because you're not in a thicket. Yeah.
I use cat-tan quite a bit for my fungicide,
Uh-huh.
and I've heard that it has the potential to also drop fruit. And so
I don't know that. I don't. It may.
I was spraying it. I just wondered if you'd heard that as well.
I had not heard that. I had not heard it, but I would definitely look at that label and see if it says that on
It
there.
tells you to spray when it's just starting to fill out a little bit. You
Okay.
wait till it gets to be about quarter size.
Yeah, when they get to be about 25 millimeters, about an inch in size, they're pretty tough to knock off the tree unless you're physically removing them at that point. Chemicals just won't touch them at that point. So,
What have you heard about GMO apples?
oh, brand new. You're a quick study. GMO apples were announced, a week ago? Came out of Canada. There's two varieties, and I can't remember the name of them, but basically one will be like a modified Granny Smith, and one will be like a Golden Delicious modified. Side by side, you won't know the difference. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing. That's up to you, and they won't be labeled as far as I know at this time, so you could identify them. But basically, the genes have been modified in such a way that they won't turn brown. So once you cut that fruit, it will not turn brown. Now, so you all are thinking, well, why did you need a GMO? I could just put a real weak solution of vinegar or lemon juice on there and do the same thing. But this is a way that you can preserve the appearance of the apple. It's not going to preserve the quality of the apple. It's still going to be aging, but yeah, they're coming. And if you want to have your say about whether or not they should be labeled, that's speak up. So, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I can do that, sure. Here. Okay, thank you very much.
Hey, let's give everybody a shout of hands.
I do, yeah.
I was raised on a fruit farm in Michigan.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I love going to Michigan. That's beautiful up there. I love it up there.
Obviously,
Between Coloma and
some of you may have
Waterville.
seen that